Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session. I am Kristen Faris, Senior Vice President of Sales Solutions at Checkr. I've worked at Checkr for 4 years now, and before we kick off, I just want to tell you a little bit about Checkr, and even more importantly, our mission, which is very near and dear to my heart. So who is Checkr? Simply put, we're a company that is on a mission to use technology to make background checks faster and fairer. We were established in 2014 and have grown very quickly over the last 7 years. With our recent Series Z, we're valued at $4.6 billion. Checkr truly is built for the future of work, and we're building technology to create opportunities for all. We believe that all candidates, regardless of who they are, should have a fair chance to work. And that's why we've designed a faster and more fair way to screen job seekers. Checkr helps to remove bias from the hiring process by automating many areas that have traditionally been really manual and extremely decentralized. We then layer in deep analytics to help employers understand how their hiring criteria is impacting both their diversity efforts as well as the talent funnel so that they can make more informed decisions about background check program design and administration. Many of the fastest growing businesses in the world use Checkr technology to easily initiate and review background checks seamlessly and without bias. Our customers include companies like Lyft, Instacart, Netflix, Airbnb, Drift, Coinbase, and tens of thousands of other customers, from startups like many of you in the audience to Fortune 500 employers. We have a goal to work with our customers in the broader tech community to unblock 3 million candidates in 2021. And we're excited to participate in the North American Summit to share lessons learned with other innovators that can help move the needle to create a fair future for all. So today we'll be talking about recruiting, hiring, and retaining diverse talent teams. We have an open panel discussion on the best tools, hiring processes, and secret ingredients that support every strong, diverse team. I'm excited to be joined by Shuo Wang, co-founder and CRO at Deel, Courtney Ederle, VP of People at MainStreet, and Joanie Wang, Director of Marketing and Brand at Expensify. Welcome all, and thanks for joining me. So we all know diversity shouldn't just be an afterthought, right? You have to come into it really recognizing the benefits of diversity. It truly needs to be a strategic effort. But often we hear from startups, our goal is survival. Everything else takes a back seat to that. We hear things like, when I get funded, I'll make sure there is some diversity. But we all know that doesn't really work. So I think maybe Joanie, I'll direct the first question to you. How can founders get out of this mentality and really keep themselves accountable to own the responsibility for making sure that DE&I are company priorities?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kristen. So, I think exactly as you said, it's impossible to, I think it's very difficult to be successful at DE&I if you're leaving it as an afterthought, right? And as a founder, you kind of get to control every aspect of your company from day one. And so whether you're, for those of you in the audience, whether it's day 1, day 50, day 500 here for you, something that has helped us at Expensify is we think about how do we incorporate DE&I principles directly into our company values, directly into our company ethos and our mission and goals, right? And so a lot of times, especially as early founders, it's like, okay, how do I, you're thinking about the product, you're thinking about growth, you're thinking about development. But I think one thing that gets overlooked pretty quickly is the team and as a result, the culture that you're trying to build. So don't just think about expertise, but try to set up, where you want to be, where do you want to go every single day, 5 days a week, 40 hours for, maybe a couple years, a decade, whatever that is, right? And so who do you want to surround yourself with? How do you want to grow yourself and yourself as a team? And think about those early on, right? Because that will greatly affect the rest of your trajectory as a company, as you know. And so I think accountability is different for every company, again, depending on your priorities and your culture and how you'll measure, success. So for some people, it might be numbers and constantly looking at numbers and making sure that you're hitting your targets. For some people, it's investing more on the culture and individual, policy side. But I think making sure that you kind of have a mix of both and making sure that you're always keeping your finger on the pulse and incorporating it into everything that you do, whether it's sales, marketing, people development, all of this stuff is the way to make sure that you're not just leaving it, on the back burner until it's relevant.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we learned at Checkr very early on is that if you don't start with your diversity efforts early, you end up somewhat behind the eight ball, right? So we have very, very lofty diversity goals. We know diverse candidates refer diverse candidates. And if you start with a very kind of homogenous group of individuals, trying to, after the fact, build that diversity becomes harder and harder every year as you're growing. Sure, I wonder what your experience has been as a founder.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking like, diversity meaning they can like we have different perspectives for the company, right? And then like multiple perspectives is always better than just one single perspective, right? And then that means it can different multiple perspectives can help us with like a better product, right? Be more considerate, and then like our product can fit in multiple like needs of other clients. Right. So I think at the very beginning, when we start to form the companies, when we start to form the initial group, we should think about the diversity, right? And then we should not be biased. And then I think diversity is not something nice to have, is something like, fits in the modern culture, right? And then at the very beginning, fundamentally, when we build the founding team, we should think about diversity, and then it can only benefit the future development of the company. Yeah.
I think adding on to that, really thinking through if you're an earlier stage company, like if you're day one, like was mentioned earlier, as you're having these conversations with your early hires, talk about how important diversity is to you and what it means to you. Continue to adapt that as you grow your team, what diversity means to your company, but make sure it's part, especially on your leadership team, it's part of every recruiting conversation that you have, how much you value it, because it shows your employees, your future employees, that they need to continue that on too and carry on that conversation as they're hiring their teams.
Right, make it more about just filling a quota, right? Make it truly part of the culture of the company. One of the first mistakes that we often see early stage founders make is thinking they only have a pipeline problem. You don't just want to find candidates, you also want them to choose your company. And most importantly, after they join, you want them to feel accepted, welcome, and heard. So it's more than just about getting them in the door, but it's about making folks successful once they're at your company. How can startups better establish a safe and welcoming environment for new employees? Joanie, maybe I'll throw that one to you again to start with, and we can go around the table.
Yeah, so I think that the first thing that comes to mind here is that, studies have shown that if you just have more than one diverse candidate in a pipeline, it really reduces the likelihood of that person getting tokenized or stereotyped based on that specific visual aspect of who they are, right? Or, and it kind of goes back to the idea of representation for me. So, if there's only one minority in whatever sense of that word, right, in that mix, there's a lot of weight put or expectation put on them, right? So if it might have something to do with unconscious bias or things like this, but really, like, if you're able to add multiple types of people into that pipeline, like, you're able to get more of a breadth of range of like human, personality and things like that. And so I think that's just one thing to keep in mind, like when we're looking at where are we going and where are we hiring, what we're looking for, because there are a ton of things that we can do, both on the inside, like internally, as well as making sure that the process itself is pretty equitable.
Courtney?
Yeah, I think the other thing to add here is it's not just about the recruiting stage, it's about the onboarding stage as well. And I think regardless of what size you are or how many people you have at your company, you can build some sort of an onboarding experience that welcomes people and makes them feel part of a community. If you're a smaller company, maybe you're not in super hyper growth mode, make sure you're setting up meetings for people to meet everyone in the company early on, making a space to hear their opinions, and just starting to build trust by soliciting feedback and showing how much you value them. I'd say if you're a bigger company, you're growing fast, highly recommend that you have an onboarding program that really focuses on learning the business and learning the job, but also building those connections and kind of that community across your company. This means that maybe you have some ERG leaders that come in or some diversity advocates that come in and speak to an entire new hire group. You have Slack and channels and other content that help people feel like they have common connections. And you're just really focused over those first 6 months on fostering those connections. I think a great example that often you see in a tech community is you have a first female joining a team of all males. And when that happens, you have to be very open about it and you have to talk about it together. If you're that person's leader, you have to make sure that you're giving that female space to speak up if they're not getting an opportunity to speak up in meetings, taking a pause, calling it out, saying, hey, so-and-so, do you have anything to add here? And just making sure that you and maybe your first female hire are having true feedback sessions that create a safe space to bring up what's working and what's not working so you can continue to improve it. I think just taking some additional steps and being very mindful of it goes a long way.
I agree. I mean, unconscious bias is real, right? And so making sure that we are encouraging our teams to recognize the behavior, I think, first and foremost, and then creating that safe space is so critical for helping, any kind of diversity within the company flourish. Talking about bias in the interview process, what kinds of strategies have you used or are you considering for eliminating bias in the interview process? I'll throw it to anybody who wants to answer.
I can start with that. I think for Deel, we're a fully distributed company. So we have right now almost 300 employees across 45 different countries. And then for our leadership team, we have a lot of people with different background, and then very diversified a leader group, right? So during interview processes, we focus on that, right? So we have leaders from different perspectives, different culture, different background to conduct the interview process, right? And then during the interview, we're trying to we're trying to create an unbiased environment, okay? And then when interviewers and then all the candidates or talents that we interview, they can feel that culture, and then they can see, okay, the leader or the manager of this group has a diversity, and then they feel more confident, and then we are creating a branding around that, so that we can number one attract more candidates with a diversity, and also from top down we focus on hiring people with different diversity backgrounds. So once we have the managers with different perspectives, and I think the rest of the interview process is much easier and smooth.
Yeah, and to add on to that a little bit, I think something in addition to understanding your unconscious bias and making sure that it's something that's always at the forefront and checking when you're going through these interviews. I think one thing to know or to keep in mind is that it's always evolving, right? For a lot of diversity and inclusion and equity learning, it's never ending because there are always ways that things will change, and depending on how people interact and how things go. And so one, it's on the team side, making sure that that exists. Something that we do oftentimes is for our interviews, we put, so at Expensify, interviews are open. Anyone who wants to join in the company, regardless of your team, you can, right? But one thing we try to make sure to do is there is a core group of people who are attending who are part of different teams, right? So if it's an engineering interview, we want to make sure that the candidate gets along well with our success members, our marketing members, our sales team. And so that way, because our culture is not dependent on one team, it's making sure that everyone gets along and everyone can contribute to our, our transparent and open culture. And so humility is a big aspect of that, right? And making sure that you get along with everyone and having that different perspective and different experience really kind of highlights that for us. It's really easy to tell when we go to lunch with a candidate if they're just not, if they're not interested in that. And that's okay, right? But because there are plenty of other companies with different cultures out there. But for us, it's really important that it's hey, can I hang out with you? Are you excited to hang out with me just to get a lunch so that we can, share our perspectives and things like that. And so that's just one thing I wanted to add on to what Shuo was saying, because I feel like it's something that there's so many ways to do this, right? But it is constantly changing. And so we all honestly need to constantly be learning and keeping up with that.
Completely agree. I'd add on, the two things that I've seen work well is invest in training if you can. We at MainStreet just did an internal training for our managers, and we're rolling out to the entire company. Just recognizing that unconscious bias is there, and you do have biases, and how you can recognize that and kind of check that before you go into an interview. And then we also just partnered with a company called Life Labs to do behaviors of inclusion training as well. And I think that helps during the interview process. The second thing is just making sure you have clearly defined interview plans and making sure that everyone knows what everyone else's interview plans are. Meaning, you know, if you're going into an interview, you don't need to cover every single thing. You need to cover your topics. You need to trust that your other interviewers are covering things too. And it just really helps eliminate that bias and going down a rabbit hole of asking so many questions and just staying your course on what you're interviewing for.
Absolutely. What we do too is we have kind of rubrics of, you know, how, like, specific criteria in terms of judging how a candidate is performing on, like, you know, on the interview, right? Like, how are their answers? There's challenges on site, and so that way people aren't just relying on, well, I think this, right? Because it might have just been one small action that just completely changed your view of that person, and so we want to make sure that we're as, you know, as equal as possible between all the different candidates as we're talking to them. So having a rubric helps. Having like a common code of conduct helps as well.
Plus one on all of those. I think one of the things that Checkr that we've also done is to think about not testing for pedigree, right? We believe that a diverse set of experiences are really important. And so instead really focusing on, tell me how you've solved this problem in the past, right? So it's not about what school did you go to or where have you worked, but really do you have the experience, the lived experience to solve the kinds of problems that we're trying to solve? I think as you move up funnel, one of the other areas where there's obviously a lot of filtering out is in that screening process. So I'm wondering how have you all thought about improving the screening process for candidates by either using broader language in the text of the job description or in the filters used to select qualified candidates? We see this a ton. We are a fair chance employer, obviously, as I talked about our mission. And so what we know is that there is language that can be very intimidating to people in the job description. So we've had a lot of focus there and would love to understand some of your experience there. Sure, I saw you smiling, so maybe you can you take that one first?
Oh, I feel like for Deel, our JD is very general. It's very broad. I think in job description, focus on the responsibilities, okay, and then focus on the value that the candidate or the talent can create for the company or can contribute to the product, right? So I think fundamental, think from the principles, like what problem that we're trying to solve, and then what kind of solutions that you can provide, right? And then what are some of the skill sets that we think or our experience that we think you can have, which could be a good fit for this position. I think a general, fundamental, and then think about the basics could help, like instead of like a lot of very specific requirements. Yeah.
I think, as a woman in sales, one of the things that we talk a lot about is like putting things like hunter or killer in the job description, right? As a female, those aren't things that I necessarily identify with. It doesn't mean that I'm not a phenomenal salesperson, right? But that nuance in language is so important. Joanie, Courtney, what are your thoughts?
Happy to go. I think one additional thing that like we really try to do here and that I've seen be successful at other companies is we have a diversity and inclusion statement at the bottom of all of our job postings. And it says how much we value it. And, I was actually talking to one of our recruiters this morning, our recruiting manager actually, and she said that oftentimes diverse candidates will still reach out to her and say, hey, I don't qualify for everything, but I'd love to have a conversation. And it just promotes that conversation. Maybe they're not a great fit for that one role, but it helps the recruiting team understand where they could be a fit. And it opens up just, a conversation about life here at MainStreet. So not just limiting yourself to those qualifications, saying we're open to having conversations. And that does help a lot.
We have a little blurb like that as well, where it's like, don't see a role that fits you, like email us anyway, and let's chat, right? I think it's about opening those doors. And I completely agree, Kristen, about what you were saying earlier in terms of like the language that you use, because I know in the startup world, it's been a while since I've job hunted. So, let me know if this is a little outdated, but like, I just remember seeing things like marketing ninja or sales, like, wizard. And I was like, I don't want to be these things. Like, it's fun and whatever, but it's such a weird way, right? And I think startup culture in general has a tendency to really get into that kind of jargon. And so my recommendation again is, like, if you're looking for people outside of this space, or, who want to come into startups, maybe it's their first one, or maybe it's your company specifically or the industry, is to make sure that language is as simple as possible, right? Because, and as straightforward as possible, because there's no like hidden meaning or interpretation, or just like you said, you might accidentally turn off people because they don't identify with the language that you're using.
And I think we said we'd talk about tools here. One tool I haven't personally used, but I know about, is Textio. And they do help with job descriptions or other internal communications, and making sure that your language is very inclusive. And it will flag if it tends to be, more attractive to males or females, or how to get to that middle mark. So I've seen it before. It's really cool, but I haven't used it, so I can't speak to it personally.
Great tip, Courtney.
Another thing that we always add on the JD is the value of the company, the principles of the company. Okay, and then we want to use our company value, our company principles, and also a culture to attract the talents as well, to make them feel comfortable, to make them feel like, okay, this is the company that I'm going to have a good time with, right? And then later on, they will be able to see the responsibilities, the specific positions. And then often, like, a candidate's talents will search around, like, on LinkedIn, on Glassdoor, or on any other, platforms that they can search about your company culture, about, like, what is working at Deel, like what is working at Checkr, like, right? So make those content available as well. So build the culture, build the branding, I think is rather important. Yeah.
Awesome. I think last question for the afternoon. So remote work is obviously a hot topic right now. Any thoughts on how expanding the hiring pipeline to include remote candidates increases opportunities to increase diversity recruiting?
Happy to start here. So I think, I've worked remotely for 5+ years. So even before the pandemic, I was working remotely. And I think a lot of times you think, or people hear, that when you can hire from anywhere, it instantly means that you have more of a pipeline. And that's true. But what that statement's lacking is that diverse candidates don't always see themselves at your business, and you need to go to them and show them how they belong, and how there'll be a community for them when they join your company. You can't just think that they're going to apply. So I think, hiring remotely really helps in connecting you to different communities or different groups, not just at a national stage, but also at a local stage. So thinking, here at MainStreet, we're starting to partner with NCWIT, which is National Council for Women in Technology, out in tech, Black Tech Pipeline, Black Product Managers. There's many groups out there. And when you're limited to just a couple of zip codes, you're not going to have that expansive network and that expansive community to try to work together. So I think, having the ability to do that. There's also, when you're working remotely, it's not just about geography. It's also about, some people don't have the ability to commute an hour plus every day, whether you're a single parent or you're a family with one car, or you have limited access to transportation. I think it helps you think to kind of those other talent pools that are usually roadblocked by having to commute. And then my final thought on this one is, there are a lot of introverts out there in the world, and, a lot of introverts thrive in a remote community. They might feel timid in an office. They might not feel like they could be their true selves. So it really gives people to form those connections and bring their best self to work when they feel more comfortable behind a screen.
Yeah, to add on to that, I would say, meeting them where they are, in addition to partnering with organizations on a national and local level. I would say, even as something as like putting a job description up, on LinkedIn, and having it specify the city, right? So not everyone wants to live in New York City or San Francisco, or I don't know, Chicago, I guess, is maybe another big one, but not everyone wants to live in those cities, right? So what we've started doing is putting specific job descriptions out for like Atlanta, for Boston, for Dallas, for all these different places that we know have historic and honestly like growing diverse communities. And what we're saying there is, look, we're specifically hiring in your community. We're willing to, we're in it to grow our remote workforce here. So it's not just going to be you, right? Because I think for a lot of people, like, if you've been working for remote for a really long time, that's really awesome. But it's also a new trend that's been happening recently, right? So in order to kind of capitalize on that, it's like, not only am I saying specifically I want to grow in these communities, our company, but then thinking about how do we support them afterwards or during, right? How can we make sure that they're set up for success? Like maybe that comes in the form of benefits. So it's like everybody just gets their internet comp. So nobody has to worry about having, a crappy internet connection. Maybe it's something else like what we do is something called fist bumps. We just randomly pair up employees once a week to have a random fist bump meeting with each other. And so that way you get to know each other. And so there's a little bit from a strategy side, like how to specifically focus on where you want to go, but then also how do you support them afterwards to make sure that it still feels like they're part of the team.
I wish that we had another 30 minutes. This has been such a great conversation, but I think we're getting the hook. So thank you all for taking the time. I've learned a ton in this very brief time. I hope everybody has as well in the audience. So thank you all for joining me, and I hope you guys have a great afternoon.